The gavel hit the wooden desk with a crack that sounded like a gunshot in the hollow silence of the room. It did not just end the previous statement. It demanded a response. Samuel stood at the defendant's podium, the air in the courtroom biting and thin. Before we continue, please kindly subscribe for more romance stories and be the first to get the update on new stories. His pulse hammered against his throat, a frantic, uneven rhythm that he tried to suppress by digging his fingernails into his palms. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, waiting for him to justify his presence in a city that had spent the last year trying to push him out. He shifted his weight, his boots scraping against the polished floor, the only sound in the room besides the hum of the ventilation system. He knew the eyes of the gallery were on him, but he felt entirely alone. He took a sharp, shallow breath, trying to force his lungs to expand. He braced his feet, locked his knees, and prepared to face the judge, knowing that the next few words would determine his future. The camera moved closer, ignoring the judge in the gallery, focusing entirely on Samuel. His jawline was set, a sharp, rigid line that betrayed the exhaustion he refused to speak aloud. He did not blink. His eyes remained fixed on the bench, though his focus had clearly drifted inward. His hands, resting on the edge of the podium, were the only part of him that failed to maintain composure. They shook, with a rhythmic, involuntary tremor. Between his fingers, he clutched a single sheet of paper, the scholarship letter. It was crumpled at the edges, the ink slightly blurred from being folded and unfolded 1,000 times. He smoothed the paper with his thumb, a desperate, repetitive motion that served as his only anchor. The document represented 3 years of labor, late nights, and the systematic dismantling of his future. He held it as if it were the only physical evidence of his existence in this city. He took a long, steadying breath, his chest rising and falling against the edge of the podium. He knew the contents of the letter by heart, yet he gripped it tighter. The courtroom walls seemed to dissolve, replaced by the humid, electric air of Incheon Airport 3 years prior. Samuel stepped through the sliding glass doors, his feet heavy from the long flight, his eyes wide as he took in the sprawling, neon-lit expanse of Seoul. He carried only one suitcase, its wheels clicking rhythmically against the polished terminal floor. Around him, the crowd moved with a frantic, synchronized purpose that made him feel like a ghost in the machine. He stopped near a pillar, the weight of the handle biting into his palm, and scanned the arrival board. Every character on the screen was a puzzle he had yet to solve. He adjusted his grip on the suitcase, the plastic handle slick with sweat, and pushed forward into the sea of commuters. The air smelled of ozone, coffee, and the metallic tang of a city that never slowed down. He did not know a single soul in this country, yet he felt a surge of adrenaline. He stepped out into the night, the city lights reflecting in his eyes, a map of his future unfolding in the distance. The neon lights of the city quickly faded, replaced by the damp, subterranean silence of Gwanak-gu. Samuel descended the concrete stairs, his footsteps echoing against the narrow walls of the stairwell. He reached the bottom and pushed open a heavy, rusted door. The room was barely large enough to hold a single bed and a desk. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly and casting long, erratic shadows that danced across stacks of engineering textbooks. The air here was heavy, smelling of mildew and the stagnant humidity that clung to the walls. He dropped his suitcase, the sound dull against the thin linoleum floor. Every movement was restricted. He could touch both walls by simply extending his arms. He cleared a space on the desk, pushing aside a stack of papers to make room for his laptop. The desk wobbled, one leg shorter than the others, forcing him to wedge a folded piece of cardboard underneath to keep it steady. He sat down, the chair groaning under his weight, and looked at the complex equations waiting for him. The bulb overhead buzzed, a thin, metallic sound that grated against the silence. Samuel ignored it, his pen moving rapidly across the graph paper. He was calculating structural loads for a bridge design, his focus so narrow that the rest of the world ceased to exist. Every few minutes, the light would dip, casting the room into near darkness before snapping back to a sickly yellow glow. He shifted his chair, angling his body to maximize the reach of the light. His eyes burned, dry and gritty from hours of staring at fine print. But he didn't stop. He traced the lines of the diagram, his hands steady despite the fatigue pulling at his shoulders. Outside, the muffled rumble of a subway train vibrated through the floorboards, a reminder of the millions of people living just feet above his head. He was a stranger in a city that spoke a language he was still learning, surrounded by equations that were the only thing he truly understood. He reached for his water bottle, found it empty, and set it back down with a sharp click. The cold seeped through the concrete walls, chilling his skin, but he ignored it. He turned the page and began the next calculation. The walls of the basement seemed to pulse with the weight of the silence, finally driving Samuel to stand. He needed air. He grabbed his keys and climbed the concrete stairs, pushing out into the night. The sky above Seoul was a bruised purple. He had only walked 3 blocks when the first heavy drops hit the pavement, cold and sharp. Within seconds, the drizzle turned into a relentless downpour. He pulled his collar up, but the water soaked through instantly, chilling him to the bone. He scanned the street for shelter and saw the bright, buzzing sign of a convenience store. He sprinted, his boots splashing through deep puddles, and ducked under the glass awning. The bell above the door chimed a thin, sharp note as he stepped inside. The air was warm, smelling of instant coffee and floor wax. He stood on the rubber mat, water dripping from his hair. He shook his head, droplets flying, and looked up to find his bearings. That was when he saw her. She turned, her gaze meeting his. Samuel stood frozen, water still trailing from his sleeves onto the linoleum floor. He felt the weight of his empty pockets, his eyes scanning the shelves for something cheap enough to stretch his remaining coins. He reached for a pack of instant noodles, hesitated, and put it back. The price was too high for the night. A hand reached past him, placing a different, smaller package on the shelf. He turned to see her. She pointed to a discounted meal set, her expression bright and unburdened. She laughed, a clear, sharp sound that seemed to cut through the hum of the store. She grabbed 2 items, checked the expiration dates with practiced ease, and handed one to him. Her movements were quick and efficient. She didn't ask why he was dripping wet or why he looked so exhausted. She simply started talking about which flavor of sauce was actually worth the price. Her laughter returned, bubbling up as she mimicked the taste of a particularly bad instant soup she had tried once. Samuel felt his shoulders drop, the tension of the long study session finally leaching out of his muscles. He nodded, listening, and for a moment, the cold rain outside didn't matter at all. The rain had slowed to a steady mist by the time they pushed back out into the street. Samuel clutched his bag, the plastic crinkling under his grip. Beside him, she walked with a light, rhythmic stride, seemingly unbothered by the damp air. She stopped at the corner, turning to check the traffic, her face illuminated by the flickering neon signs of the street. She spoke about her classes, the difficulty of her exams, and the struggle of finding good coffee near the campus. Not once did she mention the world she actually inhabited. She moved through the city with a casual grace, stopping to look at a street vendor's display as if she had all the time in the world. Samuel watched her, struck by how easily she navigated the ordinary. There was no shadow of influence, no hint of the massive conglomerate that her family commanded. She was just a student, grounded and present. She laughed again at a passing car splashing through a puddle, her voice rising above the city hum. He felt a rare sense of stability, unaware that the person walking beside him was living 2 entirely different lives. They reached the riverbank, where the city noise faded into the rhythmic lap of water against concrete. The bridge lights stretched across the dark surface in long, shimmering ribbons of gold and white. Samuel stopped, leaning his forearms against the cold metal railing. He looked out at the horizon, the vastness of the city suddenly feeling less like a cage and more like a map. Ji-eun stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the distant skyline. She asked him about the engineering projects he obsessed over in his basement. He hesitated, then began to describe the structural designs he wanted to build, his voice gaining strength as he spoke of efficiency and innovation. He talked about his desire to create something that would last, something that could withstand the pressure of time. Ji-eun listened, nodding, and then she shared her own hope, a dream of building something meaningful, something that wasn't dictated by the expectations of others. The city lights cast long shadows around them, but in that space, between the water and the sky, their dreams felt tangible. The seasons shifted with brutal efficiency. The golden warmth of the riverbank gave way to a biting, metallic wind that swept through the Gwanakgu alleys. Seoul turned into a landscape of gray concrete and frozen glass. For Samuel, the winter was usually a period of isolation, a time when the cold seeped through the thin walls of his basement and settled into his bones. This year, the pattern broke. Every evening, he met Ji-eun at the campus library or the small cafe near the subway entrance. They spent hours huddled over textbooks, their breath visible in the air, their hands occasionally brushing as they reached for the same notes. When the frost coated the windows, they walked faster, shoulders pressed together to share the meager heat. Samuel found himself looking forward to the stinging wind, because it meant the walk back to the station, where they would talk until the last train arrived. She brought him hot tea in a thermos, a small gesture that became a ritual against the plummeting temperatures. The city felt hostile, but the space between them remained constant. The diner was empty, save for the hum of a refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock. Samuel sat opposite Ji-eun, his fingers tracing the rim of a ceramic mug until his knuckles turned white. The warmth of the tea did nothing to stop the tremors in his hands. He looked up, his eyes fixed on the flickering neon sign outside, and finally spoke the words he had been burying for months. He confessed the crushing weight of his scholarship, the constant, gnawing fear that a single misstep would result in his immediate deportation. He described the nightmares of returning home empty-handed, of failing the family that had sacrificed everything to send him abroad. He spoke of the isolation of being a foreigner in a city that demanded perfection. Ji-eun sat perfectly still, her gaze locked on his face. She listened to every word, her own hands gripped tightly under the table. She remained silent, absorbing his vulnerability while the secret of her father's influence burned in her chest, a weight she could not yet share. They stepped out of the diner and into the heart of the city, where the atmosphere shifted instantly. The narrow, dimly lit streets gave way to the sprawling, metallic expanse of the business district. Above them, skyscrapers surged toward the clouds, their glass facades reflecting the cold, artificial glow of the metropolis. These buildings were not just architecture. They were monuments to a world of influence and capital that Samuel had only ever seen from the outside. He stopped on the sidewalk, his gaze tracking the height of the steel beams until his neck ached. The sheer scale of the structures made him feel small. Beside him, Ji-eun walked with a different rhythm, her eyes scanning the familiar skyline with a detached familiarity. They walked past the grand entrances of global headquarters, where security guards stood like statues behind polished granite. The contrast was absolute. Every step toward the center of the district felt like moving deeper into a territory where their connection had no place to exist. The routine felt solid, a rhythm they had perfected over months of shared lunches and quiet walks. They met in the shadow of a public library, exchanging books and brief, guarded smiles. Neither noticed the black sedan idling 3 blocks away, its windows tinted to a deep, impenetrable charcoal. Inside the vehicle, a man adjusted a long-range lens, the mechanical click of the shutter muffled by the passing traffic. He tracked their movements as they sat on a park bench, recording the way Samuel leaned in to share a joke. The images were transmitted instantly to a secure server in a high-rise office miles away. High above the city, the CEO sat behind a desk of polished mahogany, his attention diverted by a notification on his tablet. He zoomed in on Samuel's face, his finger hovering over the screen. The connection was clear. The heavy oak doors of the executive suite swung open, and Ji-eun stepped into the room. The space was vast, dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. Her father did not look up from his desk immediately. He waited until she reached the center of the room before he spoke. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he reached out and slid a thin, black folder across the polished surface. It stopped inches from her hand. Inside were the images taken at the park. He finally looked at her, his expression devoid of warmth or curiosity. He spoke of the family name, of the years spent building an empire, and of the precarious nature of their social standing. To him, Samuel was not a person, but a variable that threatened the stability of their future. He dismissed the relationship as a temporary lapse in judgment, a mistake that required immediate correction. He pointed to the photos, his finger tracing the outline of Samuel's face. With clinical detachment, he made it clear that their connection was a liability, a flaw in the design of their life that he intended to erase. There was no room for debate. He told her that the association would end, and that any further contact would result in consequences far beyond her control. He stood up, walked to the window, and turned his back. The directive was issued before the office doors had even closed. Within hours, the machinery of influence began to turn. Samuel noticed the first shift during his morning commute. The bus he took every day failed to stop at his usual corner, forcing him to walk through a neighborhood he did not know. When he arrived at the campus library, his access card was rejected by the turnstile. The security guard did not offer an explanation, only a blank stare and a gesture toward the exit. Samuel stood in the lobby, his pulse quickening as he tried the card again. It remained dead. He walked to the cafeteria, but his student account showed a zero balance, despite the funds he had deposited only yesterday. He stood by the counter, the noise of the room fading into a dull hum as he realized the pattern. It was not a glitch. Every door he touched seemed to lock just before he reached it. He retreated to the quiet of the campus courtyard, but even there, he felt the weight of unseen eyes. A sedan, identical to the one that had followed him days prior, idled at the curb. The walls were closing in, and the air around him grew thin with the sudden, sharp realization that he was no longer moving through the city as a free man. Samuel climbed the stairs to his apartment, the silence of the building feeling heavier than usual. He reached into his mailbox and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope marked with the official seal of the Immigration Bureau. His fingers fumbled with the paper as he tore it open. The text was formal, cold, and precise. It stated that his residency status was under immediate review due to a reported breach of academic compliance. He read the lines twice, searching for a mistake. The floor beneath him seemed to tilt. He pulled out his phone, his thumb shaking as he dialed the contact number. The line rang 4 times before an automated system cut him off. He tried again, but the call failed instantly. A cold sweat broke across his forehead. This was not a bureaucratic error. It was a surgical strike. He paced the small room, the walls pressing in as the reality took hold. He gripped the edge of his desk until his knuckles turned white, the paper trembling. The panic was a suffocating weight, and he saw no path forward. Ji-eun arrived at the usual meeting point, her pace brisk and her smile fixed in place. She spoke of the upcoming semester and the books she had borrowed, her voice light and carefully measured. She sat on the bench, hands folded in her lap, and pointed toward the river as if nothing had changed. Samuel watched her, the letter from the Immigration Bureau burning a hole in his pocket. He opened his mouth to tell her about the notice, about the sudden loss of his access, and the cold silence of the administrative offices. Ji-eun interrupted him before he could speak, asking about a movie they had discussed weeks ago. Every time he tried to steer the conversation toward the threats, she pivoted back to trivialities, her laughter sounding brittle. An invisible wall rose between them, built of her desperate need to pretend and his growing need for the truth. The lecture hall felt colder than usual as Samuel took his seat in the back row. He waited for the professor to finish the session, clutching his notebook with questions about his thesis. When the room finally cleared, he approached the front desk, but the professor was already gathering papers with rapid, dismissive movements. Samuel spoke his name, but the man didn't look up. He simply muttered that he was busy and walked toward the exit without breaking stride. Samuel followed him into the hallway, his voice steady despite the sudden spike in his pulse. He asked for a moment to discuss his recent project, but the professor stopped, turned, and looked past him, as if he were invisible. The man stated that his schedule was full for the foreseeable future and advised Samuel to consult the department head instead. The dismissal was sharp, final, and devoid of the usual academic warmth. As Samuel stood in the corridor, he noticed other faculty members stepping into their offices and closing their doors as he approached. The message was clear. His presence was no longer welcome, and the institution was actively distancing itself from his future. The notification arrived as a single, stark email on his phone. It was a formal summons to the dean's office, scheduled for the end of the hour. Samuel left the library, his footsteps echoing too loudly in the marble hallway. He passed the security desk, but the guard on duty kept his eyes fixed on the monitor, refusing to offer the usual nod of recognition. The air in the building felt stagnant, heavy with the scent of floor wax and old paper. Every door he passed remained firmly shut, and the usual hum of student activity had vanished, replaced by a silence that felt intentional. He reached the administrative wing, where the lighting was dimmer and the shadows stretched long across the polished floor. A secretary sat behind a glass partition, typing with rhythmic, mechanical precision. She did not look up when he approached the counter, only gesturing toward the heavy oak door at the end of the hall without speaking. Samuel stood before the entrance, his hand hovering over the brass handle. He took a breath and pushed the door open, stepping into the room. The dean did not stand. He remained seated behind a massive mahogany desk, his eyes fixed on a file folder that looked thin and insignificant. He slid a single sheet of paper across the polished surface toward Samuel. The document was titled with the university seal, but the text beneath it was brief and brutal. It cited unexplained disciplinary issues as the grounds for an immediate review of his status. Samuel leaned forward, his hands pressing against the edge of the desk to keep them from shaking. He asked for clarification, demanding to know what specific incidents were being referenced. The dean finally looked up, his expression devoid of empathy or interest. He tapped the paper with a pen, stating that the decision was final and that the university was no longer required to provide a justification. Samuel tried to protest, his voice rising, but the dean raised a hand, silencing him instantly. The room felt suddenly airless. The dean informed him that his scholarship was revoked effective immediately, and his access to the campus labs would be terminated by the end of the day. Samuel stood frozen. His academic future, built over years of relentless effort, had been erased in less than a minute. He looked at the paper, then back at the man, realizing that no amount of logic could reverse the verdict. Samuel walked out of the administrative building, the heavy door clicking shut behind him with a finality that echoed in his chest. He stood on the concrete steps, the cold air biting at his skin, but he barely felt it. His mind raced, replaying the dean's words, searching for a logical reason for such a sudden, baseless decision. Then, a memory surfaced. He remembered a brief, icy conversation with Ji-eun's father weeks ago, where the man had spoken of influence and the ease with which lives could be redirected. The pieces locked together with sickening precision. This was not an academic error. It was a calculated strike. The university was merely a tool, a lever pulled by someone who viewed his future as a disposable asset. He looked at the campus grounds, once a place of opportunity, now transformed into a cage. He realized that the dean had not been acting on policy, but on instructions from a boardroom miles away. The sheer scale of the power arrayed against him made his previous struggles seem trivial. He gripped the strap of his bag until his knuckles turned white, the crushing weight of the situation settling into his bones. He had to move. He had to find a way to reach Ji-eun. Samuel turned away from the campus gates and broke into a run. Every second wasted was a second closer to total isolation. He reached the bus stop, but the digital display flickered and went dark, signaling a service delay that felt like a deliberate obstruction. He did not wait. He stepped into the street, dodging traffic, and began to sprint toward the park. His lungs burned with the cold, sharp air of the city, but he pushed his legs harder, ignoring the ache in his muscles. He navigated the crowded sidewalks, weaving through pedestrians who blurred into a wall of indifference. He needed to reach the meeting spot before the sun dipped below the skyline. He vaulted over a low concrete barrier, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The city felt vast and hostile, a labyrinth designed to keep him from the only person who mattered. He rounded the final corner, his vision narrowing to the park entrance ahead. He reached the park perimeter, skidding to a halt on the gravel path. He stood there for a moment, chest heaving, searching the shadows. Samuel stepped onto the grass, his eyes scanning the familiar benches where they usually met. The park was unnaturally quiet. Then, he saw them. 3 black sedans were parked in a tight formation across the main path, their engines idling with a low, rhythmic hum. They were positioned to block any approach to the center of the park. He slowed his pace, his pulse drumming in his ears. As he moved to circle around the vehicles, the doors opened in perfect unison. 4 men stepped out, moving with the practiced efficiency of a machine. They did not shout. They did not run. They simply stepped into his line of sight, spreading out to form an impenetrable wall of shoulders and stillness. Samuel stopped 10 feet away. He looked past them, searching for any glimpse of movement, but the park behind them was empty. He took a step forward, and the man in the center shifted his weight, blocking the path with a subtle, predatory grace. The air grew heavy, the silence of the park now feeling like a deliberate, suffocating weight. He was trapped, and the message was clear. The lead agent stepped forward, his movements precise and devoid of hesitation. Above them, the clouds curdled into a bruised, heavy gray, and the first drops of rain began to pit the dry earth. The temperature plummeted, turning the air biting and sharp. The agent reached into his pocket, pulled out a single document, and held it steady against the rising wind. He did not raise his voice, yet the words carried clearly over the rustle of the trees. He outlined the consequences of Samuel, moving 1 step closer: the immediate termination of his visa, the permanent blacklisting of his academic records, and the total erasure of his legal status in the city. Each point was delivered with the clinical detachment of a man reading a grocery list. Samuel felt the rain soak through his layers, chilling his skin, but he did not blink. The sky darkened further, casting long, distorted shadows across the grass that seemed to swallow the light. The threat was no longer abstract. It was a concrete wall. The agent waited, his gaze fixed on Samuel, expecting the inevitable retreat. The park, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage closing in as the downpour intensified. Samuel stood motionless as the rain turned the path into a slick, dark mirror. He looked at the document, then back at the agent. The threat of deportation and academic ruin hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. But he did not retreat. He planted his feet firmly into the softening mud, feeling the cold seep into his boots. He did not speak immediately. He took a slow, steady breath, forcing his heart rate to drop. When he finally looked up, his gaze was locked onto the agent. He took 1 step forward, closing the distance between them. The agent stiffened, his hand moving slightly toward his side. But Samuel did not stop. He spoke with a voice that cut through the sound of the downpour, clear and devoid of tremor. He told them that his presence here was not a matter of convenience, but a matter of principle. He would not be moved by threats of bureaucratic erasure. The agent shifted his weight, his composure flickering for the first time as he realized that fear was not going to work. Samuel held his ground, his shoulders squared against the wind. The security team exchanged a sharp, silent glance, the momentum of their intimidation stalling. The security team retreated into their black vehicles, leaving the park in a heavy, unnatural silence. Samuel walked back to the city center, his pulse still hammering against his ribs. He arrived at the warehouse where he worked the night shift, his hands still numb from the cold rain. He reached for his locker, but the padlock had been cut. His belongings were piled on the floor in a plastic crate. The manager emerged from the back office, his face a mask of practiced indifference. He did not look Samuel in the eye. He simply held out a final paycheck and a termination slip. When Samuel asked for a reason, the manager turned his back and walked away, locking the office door behind him. There was no argument to be made, no appeal to be heard. The silence in the warehouse was absolute, broken only by the hum of the overhead lights. Samuel looked at the slip in his hand, the ink still fresh. His access card was already deactivated, his name erased from the digital roster. The father's influence had moved faster than he had anticipated, cutting off his only source of income with surgical precision. He stood in the middle of the empty floor, the weight of the loss settling into his chest. Samuel walked the long blocks back to Gwangju, his pace mechanical and heavy. He reached the narrow stairwell leading down to his basement, his mind still reeling from the warehouse. He reached for his key, but his hands stopped mid-air. A bright yellow paper was taped across the frame of his door. He pulled it down, the tape tearing with a sharp dry sound. It was an eviction notice, dated for immediate enforcement. He jammed his key into the lock, but it would not turn. The cylinder had been replaced. He pounded on the wood, the sound dull and hollow. He peered through the small, grime-streaked window. His desk was gone. He leaned his forehead against the cold, wet brick of the wall, his breath hitching in the frigid air. He stood in the dark, clutching the crumpled notice, realizing he was officially displaced, with nowhere left to go. The final blow arrived not with a shout, but with a sharp vibration in his pocket. Samuel pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling as he tapped the university portal icon. The screen blinked, loading for a long, agonizing second before displaying a stark, red message. Access denied. He tried his credentials again, typing slowly, forcing his shaking hands to remain steady. The result was the same. He dialed the registrar office, his voice tight as he asked for an explanation. The voice on the other end was robotic, detached, informing him that his enrollment had been terminated effective immediately due to administrative non-compliance. He hung up, the silence of the street pressing in on him. He checked his immigration status app next. The status bar, once green and active, now displayed a gray, inactive symbol. His student visa was gone. He was no longer a student, no longer a resident, no longer a person with a place in this city. He was an undocumented ghost, invisible to the systems that had once defined his path. He looked up at the towering glass buildings surrounding him, their lights glowing with a life he was no longer permitted to touch. The city had effectively deleted him from its records, leaving him untethered and exposed to the biting wind. A black sedan pulled to the curb, tires hissing against the wet asphalt. The rear door opened, and a man stepped out. He did not look at Samuel, but at the empty space beside him. He held out a thick, white envelope. Samuel hesitated, his hands hanging limp at his sides. The man stepped closer, his presence blocking the street lamp's glow. He opened the envelope and slid a single document out. A one-way flight ticket to Lagos, dated for the following morning. The man spoke, his voice devoid of inflection, detailing the reality of the situation. If Samuel boarded, his debts would be cleared. If he stayed, he would be hunted, his name blacklisted from every institution, and his existence reduced to a cycle of poverty. The man pressed the ticket into Samuel's palm, his grip firm and cold. He laid out the binary path: return, or face a future of total obscurity. The sedan door slammed shut. The vehicle pulled away into the dark, leaving Samuel standing on the sidewalk. The weight of the choice settled into his chest. The ticket felt heavy, a paper anchor tethering him to a life he did not want. Samuel stood under the flickering street lamp, the rain beginning to soak through his layers. He looked at the departure time, then at the dark, looming skyline of Seoul. Every instinct screamed at him to take the flight, to escape the crushing weight. He folded the paper in half, then into quarters, the crisp edges biting into his skin. The silence of the street was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic drip of water. He thought of the years of study, the nights spent in the basement, and the promises he had made to himself. He realized that leaving would mean erasing every sacrifice. His grip tightened. The hesitation vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. He did not look back at the empty road. With a sudden, forceful motion, he tore the ticket in two. He ripped it again, and again, until the paper was nothing but small, sodden scraps. He let his fingers open, and the pieces fell into the gutter. He turned his back on the airport, on the safety of home, and on the easy way out. He took a breath, stepped into the rain, and began walking toward the city center, choosing the struggle over the surrender. The city did not care about his degree or his dreams. Samuel found work at a construction site before dawn, hauling bags of concrete mix that weighed more than he did. The grit of the dust coated his throat, turning every breath into a rasp. By midday, his palms were mapped with raw, weeping blisters. He gripped the shovel handle, the wood biting into the open wounds, but he did not drop it. He moved rhythmically, a machine of muscle and bone, ignoring the fire in his shoulders. When the foreman barked an order, Samuel moved faster, his focus narrowing to the pile of debris in front of him. He carried heavy steel beams up narrow stairwells, his boots slipping on the slick concrete. Each trip was a battle against gravity and his own failing stamina. He felt the skin on his knuckles split, blood mixing with the grime on his fingers. But he wiped his hands on his trousers and reached for the next load. The sun dipped below the skyline, leaving him in the shadows of the unfinished frame. He stood there for a moment, chest heaving, his body vibrating with the aftershocks of the labor. He turned and walked toward the exit, his stride heavy but steady. The construction site was only the beginning. As the sun set, Samuel moved to a commercial kitchen, scrubbing grease from industrial vats until his skin burned from the chemicals. He worked with a frantic mechanical efficiency, his movements blurred by the sheer speed required to keep his station clear. The heat in the kitchen was stifling, a wall of steam that made his vision swim. He did not speak. He did not pause. When the kitchen closed, he walked 3 miles to a logistics warehouse. This was the third shift, the graveyard hours. He scanned boxes, lifted crates, and stacked pallets in the hollow silence of the loading bay. His body moved on muscle memory alone, his mind drifting into a gray, fog-like state where time lost all meaning. He stumbled once, his foot catching on a metal floor plate, and he hit the concrete hard. He stayed there for a heartbeat, the cold floor pressing against his cheek, before forcing himself back to his feet. He could not afford to sleep. He could not afford to fail. He counted the hours until the bank opened, calculating the exact amount needed for his next tuition installment. When the morning light finally bled through the warehouse windows, he walked out into the cold air. His eyes were bloodshot, his limbs heavy as lead, but he kept moving. He reached his basement, dropped his keys on the desk, and stared at the stack of textbooks. He had 4 hours before the cycle started again. Ji-eun sat in the study, the silence of the mansion pressing against her ears. She pulled a file from the mahogany desk, her fingers tracing the ink on the page. It was a list of names, bank accounts, and directives. Her father had not just disapproved. He had orchestrated the systematic removal of Samuel from every academic and financial institution. She read the dates, the signatures, and the cold, calculated instructions to revoke the scholarship. The reality of the cruelty made her pulse spike. She stood up, her chair scraping harshly. She walked to the hallway and stopped the assistant, demanding the truth about the security team sent to the park. The assistant looked away, his silence confirming everything. Ji-eun did not scream. She turned back to the study, grabbed a small bag, and began to pack. She took only what was necessary: the evidence, her identification, and cash. She moved through the rooms with a new, sharp clarity. She bypassed the security cameras, slipping through the service entrance into the rain. The air was cold, but she did not feel it. She walked toward the subway station, her pace quick and purposeful. She had spent years living in the shadow of her father's influence, but that ended tonight. She knew exactly where the basement was. She knew exactly what she had to do. She stepped onto the train, the doors closing behind her, and she did not look back. The rain hammered against the concrete stairs, a relentless rhythm that masked her footsteps. Ji-eun reached the basement door and knocked. It was a soft, hesitant sound, barely audible over the storm. Inside, Samuel froze. He was hunched over his desk, a pen in his hand, his mind still trapped in the logic of his engineering equations. He stood up, his muscles aching, and walked to the door with his guard up, expecting the security team or another demand to leave. He pulled the door open, ready to fight, but stopped. Ji-eun stood on the threshold, her face wet with rain, holding a small bag. She did not speak. She simply stepped inside, out of the downpour. Samuel looked at her, then at the bag, then back at her eyes. The tension that had defined his life for months snapped. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched her arm to confirm she was real. She leaned into the space, the small room suddenly feeling less like a cage and more like a sanctuary. He closed the door, locking out the noise of the city and the weight of the past. They stood in the dim light. The basement became their command center. They cleared the textbooks from the desk to make room for blueprints and technical sketches. Every morning began with the search for manual labor. Every night ended with the pursuit of their engineering vision. They took jobs in construction and logistics, hauling materials and clearing debris, their hands calloused and their schedules brutal. The first project they attempted failed. The calculations were off, the materials were substandard, and the prototype collapsed under its own weight. They sat in the dark for an hour, the silence heavy with the sting of defeat. Then, Samuel picked up the pencil. He began to redraw the schematics, and Ji-eun began to source the components. They spoke only of load-bearing capacities and structural integrity. Months of labor turned into a small, registered firm. They rented a shared workspace, moving from the basement to a desk with a view of the city skyline. They stood in their new office, looking at the first contract they had secured together. They had built their own foundation, one choice at a time. The office was quiet, save for the hum of the computer fans and the scratch of a pen against paper. Samuel looked at the blueprints spread across the table, the lines precise and clean. It was a long road from the cramped basement in Gwanag-gu to this space. He remembered the cold, the hunger, and the uncertainty of those early days. He looked over at Ji-eun, who was focused on a structural analysis, her movements steady and sure. They did not need to speak to understand the weight of the moment. They had built this firm on the foundation of their shared refusal to quit. The threats, the loss of status, and the pressure from her family were now just variables in a solved equation. Samuel stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the city lights. They were no longer outsiders looking in. The struggle had forged them, and the result was a partnership that no outside force could break. They were ready. The final contract lay on the desk, signed and sealed. It was not just a document. It was the physical proof of their endurance. Samuel pushed the papers aside, his hands steady as he reached for the drafting tools. The office was no longer a temporary space, but a permanent home for their shared ambition. They had moved beyond the need for validation from those who once sought to dismantle their future. Every line drawn, every calculation verified, stood as a testament to the choices they had made in the dark. Ji-eun stood by the window, watching the city traffic flow below, the same streets they once walked in uncertainty. She turned back to the desk, her expression calm and focused. They had turned the weight of their struggle into the bedrock of their success. There was no looking back at the courtroom or the threats that once defined their days. The focus was entirely on the present, on the task at hand, and on the firm they had built from nothing. They sat together, the silence in the room no longer heavy with tension, but filled with the quiet confidence of two people who had earned their place. They picked up their pens, ready to begin the next chapter, together, as partners in every sense of the word. The lights in the office flickered off, one by one, leaving the room in the soft glow of the city skyline. Samuel walked to the door, his hand resting on the frame for a brief second. He felt the solid wood under his palm, a stark contrast to the shifting ground of his past. Ji-eun stood beside him, her keys jingling as she secured the lock. The sound echoed in the hallway, a final note of closure. They walked toward the elevator, the silence between them, comfortable and earned. They had spent years fighting for the right to exist on their own terms, and tonight, that fight was a distant memory. The city below was vast, but they were no longer lost within it. They had carved out a space that belonged solely to them. As the elevator door slid shut, the reflection in the polished metal showed two people who had weathered the storm and emerged with their resolve intact. They stepped out into the night air, the cool wind brushing against their faces, and began the walk home. The chapter of survival was closed. The morning light hit the Han River, turning the water into a ribbon of silver. Samuel and Ji-eun stood on the bridge, looking down at the path where they had once walked as strangers. The cold wind that used to bite through their resolve now felt like a reminder of the distance they had traveled. They did not speak of the obstacles or the threats that had once defined their days. Those things had lost their power, dissolved by the years of steady, deliberate work. They turned away from the railing and walked toward the city center, their pace unhurried and synchronized. Every step on the pavement was a choice they owned. They had built a firm, a life, and a future that no external force could dismantle. The city was no longer a place of survival, but a landscape of their own making. They reached the intersection where their paths had first crossed, paused for a heartbeat, and then continued forward together. There was no need to look back. The foundation they had laid was deep, and the structure they had built was standing firm. They moved into the crowd, side by side, into the steady rhythm of a new day. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the streets they now navigated with ease. They reached the entrance of their home, a place that held no echoes of the past, only the quiet hum of a life they had constructed piece by piece. Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out the key, the metal cool against his palm. He inserted it into the lock, the mechanism clicking with a sharp, definitive sound. The door swung open, revealing the warmth of the space they had claimed as their own. They stepped inside, leaving the noise of the city behind the threshold. There were no more hurdles to clear, no more authorities to answer to, and no more shadows to outrun. They sat down at the table, the same table where they had once mapped out their business plans, and looked at one another. The silence was not empty. It was full of everything they had survived. They had arrived at the destination they once thought impossible. They turned off the final lamp, letting the darkness settle in, not as a threat, but as a peaceful end to a long, hard-won day. The journey was over. The office was quiet, save for the rhythmic hum of the ventilation system. Samuel stood at the drafting table, his fingers tracing the lines of a complex schematic. These blueprints were more than just technical drawings. They were the physical manifestation of every late night and every sacrifice. He looked up to see Ji-eun standing by the window, watching the city lights flicker to life. She turned, a faint smile touching her lips, and walked over to join him. They did not need to speak to acknowledge the distance they had covered. The desk was cluttered with prototypes and notes, a stark contrast to the single worn-out letter he had once clutched in a courtroom. They had replaced fear with precision and uncertainty with a concrete plan. The challenges that once threatened to dismantle their future had instead become the foundation of their firm. They stood together in the center of the room, surrounded by the work that defined their independence. Every component, every connection, and every success was a testament to their refusal to yield. They had built something that would last, something that belonged entirely to them. They turned off the lights and walked out into the night. The story of their rise was not written in grand gestures, but in the quiet, persistent accumulation of small victories. Every day they spent working side by side in their firm was a rejection of the world that had once tried to define them by their origins. They kept the old desk from the basement, a reminder of the narrow space where they had first dared to dream. It sat in the corner of their new office, polished and sturdy, holding the weight of their history. They had learned that the barriers placed in their path were not walls, but markers of how far they had already come. The city, once a cold and alien landscape, was now the backdrop of their shared life. They had turned the uncertainty of their youth into a blueprint for a future that no external influence could revoke. The path ahead was theirs to build, one day at a time, with the same integrity that had carried them through the darkest of winters. Their journey reached its final horizon, not with a flourish, but with the quiet consistency of two people who had earned their place. They stood on the balcony of their office, looking out over the sprawling grid of the city. The lights below no longer felt like an unreachable distance, but like a map of the territory they had successfully navigated. Every challenge, every rejection, and every moment of doubt had been forged into the strength they now held. They had proven that the value of a person is measured not by the status they are born into, but by the integrity they maintain when everything else is stripped away. They turned away from the window, the glass reflecting the steady, calm light of their shared space. There were no more threats to face, no more visas to secure, and no more shadows to hide in. They had built a foundation that was entirely their own, brick by brick, through the long winters and the hard labor. The story of their struggle was now the bedrock of their peace. They walked toward the door, leaving the office behind, knowing that the most important work was already done. They had become the architects of their own destiny, and the path ahead was clear, open, and entirely theirs to command. The silence of the room was not empty. It was the sound of a life fully realized. The final chapter of their story rests not in the accolades they received, but in the quiet strength of their daily routine. They built a life that defied the expectations of those who once sought to dismantle it. Every project they completed stood as a testament to the years spent in the basement, where the only currency was perseverance. They moved through the city with the steady pace of people who had earned their place through fire and patience. Their partnership remained the anchor, a constant force that transformed every obstacle into a stepping stone. As they look back, the cold winters of the past are merely memories, distant and powerless against the warmth of the life they secured. They proved that integrity is not a fleeting choice, but a permanent state of being. If this journey has resonated with you, if you have seen your own struggles reflected in their persistence, then you understand the value of staying true to one's path. Their story is now yours to carry forward. Before you go, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support ensures that more stories of resilience and triumph find their way to those who need them most. They continue to work, to grow, and to thrive, forever defined by the character they refuse to compromise. The echoes of the courtroom and the damp walls of the basement have long since faded, replaced by the steady hum of a firm they built from the ground up. Their lives are no longer defined by the pressure of external forces, but by the quiet confidence of two people who survived the storm together. They stand as a living example that the most difficult paths often lead to the most meaningful destinations. Every late night spent working, every sacrifice made to keep their dreams alive, has culminated in this moment of stability. They have moved past the need for validation, finding peace in the work they produce and the partnership they maintain. The city that once felt like a cage is now the landscape of their success. They walk forward, not looking back at the shadows, but focused on the horizon they continue to shape. Their story remains a testament to the power of holding on to one's principles when the world demands compromise. As they close this chapter, they do so with the knowledge that their foundation is solid, their future is secure, and their bond is unbreakable. They have moved beyond the struggle into a life defined by their own terms. The journey was long, the costs were high, but the result is a legacy that will endure. They continue their work, side by side, building a future that belongs entirely to them. The journey that began with a single letter and a cramped basement room has reached its horizon. Samuel and Ji-eun now stand at the helm of their own firm, their days filled with the complex challenges of engineering. They have transformed the uncertainty of their youth into a blueprint for others who find themselves navigating hostile environments. The city, once a place of cold isolation, now recognizes them as contributors to its skyline. They operate with a quiet, deliberate focus, knowing that every structure they design carries the weight of their history. Their partnership has deepened, moving from a survival pact into a professional and personal union that remains unshakable. They remain side by side, building, growing, and proving that character is the only currency that never loses its value. Their path is set, their legacy is in motion, and their story remains a beacon of what is possible. The story of Samuel and Ji-eun is more than a record of survival. It is a testament to the choices we make when everything else is stripped away. They navigated the cold, the pressure, and the uncertainty, emerging not just as partners, but as architects of a life built on their own terms. If their journey has resonated with you, if you have found strength in their refusal to compromise, take a moment to reflect on the challenges you currently face. Their success was not a stroke of luck, but the result of persistent, daily action. If this story has touched your heart, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing these powerful, real-life accounts to light. We share these stories to remind you that even in the most isolating circumstances, integrity remains the most valuable asset you possess. Thank you for walking this path with us. Keep building, keep striving, and never lose sight of the foundation you are creating for yourself. Until next time, please kindly subscribe for more romance stories and be the first to get the update on new stories.